You're listening to Fellow Travellers with East of Moon. Welcome to Fellow Travellers, a podcast from East of Moon. We are an organisation that studies, experiments with and develops the ways in which communities create together. My name is Josie-Ann Gatens, and for this episode I was joined by Alec Shaw. Alec is a cognitive neuroscientist and linguist, currently completing his PhD from the University of Zurich. But he's also a member of Andromy, a radical social space and associated community in downtown Reykjavik. In this honest and genuine conversation, Alec reflects on the challenges communities can face and how success feels like community joy. Hi, Alec.
Hi, Josie.
Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
We're going to talk about community building and political communities, and specifically Andromy, which is a community that you've been involved in Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
But to start with, just to give some context to the listeners, I would love for you to just give a little overview of who you are and then maybe go into how you got involved in politics, how you developed as a political person.
Yeah. Okay, who am I? Big
no
question.
pressure.
Yeah,
Like just morning questions for you.
Absolutely. A little chit chat over coffee. I am a scientist. I'm doing a PhD in the cognitive neuroscience of language. I am interested in a lot of things: ecology, the natural world, technology, climate change, blah, 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 blah. Lighthearted stuff. And I guess all of that plays into my existence as a political person, political entity.
We've talked about before how each of us kind of became, I guess this is like such a horrible phrasing, but like more politically realized or kind of like stepped into our politics, understood where we landed on things. But maybe let's go through that for you. Take me to the very beginning, like what sort of family background do you have in politics? Like, where do you come from as someone who has gotten involved in these political communities?
Right. So I can't say that I come from a very political family. I don't. They're a upper middle class bunch of nice people, not so aware perhaps of the world beyond their own, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I was always kind of interested in a quote-unquote better, more fair world, however we define that. I can think about being a wee little kid, I don't know, 7 years old, and being like, I remember at school being like, we have to change all the light bulbs so that they're energy efficient. And everyone laughed at me. I'm
not laughing at you now, just to be clear. I'm loving the image.
The image, absolutely. I mean, it's just, you just have to take who I am today and shrink me. And I haven't changed.
You're the same guy.
Exactly. It was a shame, though. The glasses they didn't fit at all. So I mean, there were things like that where I was like, I was receiving these messages. I can't say where from. I don't really know, but we have to be concerned about the environment and energy consumption, and we should be thinking about climate change. At 6 or 7 years old, and though I didn't know what that was, I was like, we should probably respect the climate.
We should get on that.
We should get on that.
Someone should be looking at this.
Exactly.
And I guess it's me with my light bulbs.
There I am, helping so much. And then fast forward, I was, reading things, and I was interested in the world. I was interested in history and geopolitics. And I guess a part of that really played into where I went academically, in terms of I started learning languages on my own, and I found that really fun. I finished high school, and I went off and I decided I'm going to do linguistics. And at the time, I really, I didn't know what that was, and I thought, I'll be an interpreter at the UN or something. I'll learn all 6 official UN languages. I already speak one of them, English, so no problem. And yeah, I think that grew out of this desire to talk to people I wouldn't otherwise talk to if I didn't speak their language. And that was centered around, at the time, a strong interest in China's political development, historical development, economic development. I was learning Chinese, and I had the privilege of making several trips there. And I was interested in sort of like minority languages and language documentation. And I guess that's a nice segue over to Iceland, where, because that's how I became sort of first aware of Iceland. I was studying for exams one night when I lived in China, and I came across this music blog in Icelandic, and I couldn't read a word, but it was around the end of the year. So the first post up was sort of the, best music of the year. And I was like, okay, YouTube links, click, this is great, click, that's fantastic, click, 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 wow, amazing. And I thought the language looked interesting. I had heard a bit about it in linguistics. Icelandic has a place in the sort of linguistic imagination, shall we say. Yeah, and I also had this interest in so-called small languages, these minority languages and dialects in China, for example. And I moved away from China. I knew I liked living in other places, learning languages, and I went looking for an opportunity to come to Iceland, and I was lucky enough to find one, and I found myself here in 2015, and the rest, as they say, is history.
And from this kind of, background in linguistics, I know that you were quite influenced by Noam Chomsky as well, who I dabbled briefly in linguistics in university. This is something that I think a lot of people don't realize, this kind of dual role that Noam Chomsky plays as a critical theorist,
right?
Both in linguistics, but also in political discourse.
Yeah, certainly where I did my bachelor, Toronto is not so far from the east coast of the United States. And so there is this tradition, because Chomsky was at MIT and he had a significant influence. And his influence extends to Iceland because of one Icelandic linguist who did his PhD at Harvard, for example, so came down to Boston. So I came of age in this tradition. And I wasn't so aware of his political writing, but I became aware of it. And I distinctly recall, if we're talking about personal development, political evolution, I think I picked up Hegemony or Survival. I forget when he wrote it, and I found it too intense. I was like, oh no.
Opinions.
Strong opinions. I've actually never gone back and read it. I should do that.
That would be a nice full circle moment.
Absolutely. But I think at the time that I was coming into contact with his political work, and this book in particular, there was criticism of U.S. foreign policy post 9/11, and I was there on the same page. But I still believed in the rules-based order and all of these, tenets of, I guess, geopolitics and American foreign policy after the Second World War. And that, with diplomacy, things would be okay. And he really, wanted to pull back the curtain and say, look at all these examples of abuse of power. And I was, I guess I still had this naive notion of a very Western lens, perhaps, or something. Anyhow, but I distinctly recall being like, oof, opinions. But it was good, that's how we grow. Yeah, and I met some people in university, as one does, other rowdy youth. Not me, them. No one would describe me as rowdy, I think. And I fell in with them, and they had political opinions, and I was like, oh, wow. And I remember once taking a trip down to Pittsburgh with them in a rickety little Volkswagen that had no airbags. And I was like, boy, if we hit anything, whew, goodbye. And
that is a political learning in and of itself.
That is a political learning in itself. And that little Volkswagen came all the way from Europe. I remember I think it was somehow it got to Canada from Germany, and it was very cute. Anyhow, so we show up in Pittsburgh, and I think it's our first night there. And one of my friends buys me a beer. We're standing there having a wee chat, and then he says to me, I forget what the prompt was, but basically he was like, "What are your politics?" And I was like, I don't know, I'm milquetoast. Didn't really have a position.
Which I think is so easy to do when you come from a certain kind of background.
Absolutely.
And I'm saying that coming from it myself, when politics takes a while to reach you, of course, we're all affected by political discourse and the way that political entities operate affect all of us all the time. But when you're kind of not on the front line of it,
Exactly.
it takes a while for it to feel like it disrupts your life or it changes things for you. So you can step outside of it. And I think a lot of people do for comfort. And, you know, even though I did come from a more political, or like politics was definitely much more up for discussion in my household, it still, that was almost like an indulgency rather than a necessity. So I totally get it.
Yeah. In hindsight, you know, I feel a bit embarrassed about it, but you live and you learn and you carry on.
So from being this milquetoast wee guy in Canada in a rickety Volkswagen, you arrive in Iceland and you get involved in the IWW, right?
Yes.
Do you want to maybe just explain a little bit about what IWW is and how you got involved with it?
Yeah. So the IWW, I'm not so well versed in the history, so I hope I'm not too off base, but it was a union movement that started in the 1920s. Was rather radical, took a lot of direct action, strike action, was a very effective force for change and therefore met a significant amount of resistance. Still exists today, has spread to chapters certainly in the US and in the UK. And there is one little chapter here in Iceland ticking away. I haven't been involved with them for a while, but yeah, through this political friend who I went to Pittsburgh with, actually, he was a member of the IWW. And I didn't join up in Canada, but I came here. He came in for a visit and said, you know, there's this meeting happening. I want to go. And I tagged along with my two friends. And we show up to this house that used to be a play school. And there's this meeting room, and there's these nice people sitting around, and, you know, faces I had never seen before. And I was like, oh, cool. Hello. And yeah, without getting into it, I mean, at the end of this meeting, I signed up. I said, you know, fine, I'll join. Great. Let's do it. I'll sign my little red card. And I got a book from the library from a very dear friend, someone who would become a very dear friend, and met Anna Mariankowska there for the first time, a house member.
Yeah, house member, also associate, a fellow traveller with East of Moon, Anna, and she's very involved in union organising and in organising in general.
Absolutely. So she was there, and and that introduced me for the first time to this space called Andrimi, and I was like, oh, I've never heard of this. This is interesting. It took me a few months to come back, but I did. I forget if it was a general assembly or exactly what it was. I do remember walking in and feeling very shy, very like, I don't know this space. I don't know who's here. I don't know how things work. But there was the library.
And this is just to set the context as well, this is a free library, mostly kind of, again, books with a political...
Yeah. Absolutely. Political bent.
Yes.
And so I wandered over there, and, it was nice and quiet, and you can busy yourself looking at the shelves and everything's fine, and also get a feel for the space. And there are all these books about anarchism and feminism, queer theory, political history. And I was like, oh, wait, I want to read that, and I want to read that, and I want to read that. I want to read that one. So I just right off the bat thought, like, this is pretty cool that this is here. I didn't know that this existed, and it's nice that it exists. That there is such a thing here in Iceland, here in Reykjavik. Okay, so then I got involved. At some point, I connected, and I went to a meeting, and I got involved in a working group, and I learned some of the lingo. You know, who's going to bottom line this project? Who's going to join this working group? And I was so drawn to this feeling of community and the approach that they wanted to take with it, that no one is a boss. We don't want someone to be in charge. We're going to do it together. And it felt like, the metaphor that comes to mind is too dramatic, but like walking out of the desert. I felt like I'd carried a developing feeling of injustice with the world, anger over worsening inequality, environmental collapse, blatant examples of transphobia, queerphobia, racism, and feeling like I didn't know who I could talk to. I felt like if I brought some of these things up in other parts of my life, people were like, And I think this gets to your, a certain privileged class being like, there might be a sort of like, oh, those things suck, but like they don't actually materially affect me. And so, so I just didn't, I didn't have a space for all of these things I was feeling. And I guess it was lonely in a way. And I came into Anjumi and I connected with these people, and suddenly it was like, oh no, you are here. And I won't even say we're on the same page, but at least we're reading the same book. Like,
yeah,
like I felt like they were ahead of me. Like I was like, oh, I have, which I guess is a sort of strange feeling if you think about like involvement in politics or activism, the idea that there's, a hierarchy among people who are like, no hierarchy. But still, I was like, I want to learn from these people. They're interested in, there's stuff here that I haven't heard about. What's going on?
I suppose there can be a hierarchy of learning without being a hierarchy of authority.
Yeah, absolutely. But nonetheless, I felt like this sense of like, oh, are these my people? And I don't think I'd ever really, like I'd had that in certain contexts. But I think I really found it in Iceland, both in Anjumi and in other spaces as well, to a smaller extent. But yeah, in Anjumi, I found this like broad swath of people who were like, we're all pushing on the wheel in a certain direction. And I was like, okay, I'd like to lean in as well.
Something I think that's interesting about this is that, we're about the same age. And I too remember this experience as a young child of, I wasn't the light bulbs kid, but I was the turn off the lights kid. Mm-hmm. Turn off the tap, make sure there's no dripping taps. Yep. Like, we got to do it. It's all on me as the individual to make an individual choice that can change the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think now, knowing a little bit more about how those messages were engineered, there was a very deliberate choice to try and make individuals feel responsible for what can be done, when we all know nowadays that there are much larger factors than us at play.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that individual choices and actions don't matter, but one of the things where that, like you say, can become very lonely is where you don't have this collective attitude towards it. We're all just in our houses individually recycling or individually turning off lights and changing our light bulbs. That is something, and it does feel empowering to a certain degree. But I think we can do all of that and then look outside the window or read the news and feel like, okay, nothing is changing.
Absolutely.
And I think it's not until you get together with a group of people where you can share your frustrations, your interests, your fears, your, whatever, that starts to feel like, it's a completely different feeling, collective action and collective thinking in general. I just wonder if you can speak on that a little bit about this experience of coming from a very individual response to like what the difference was in terms of your feeling of empowerment to like, quote unquote, find your tribe.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess what you're describing is this sense that I dramatically described as like coming out of the desert. There's like a palpable sense that like, if we do it together, if we create collectively, we can do so much more. Like I think I was coming to the end of this road, realizing that yes, my individual actions, my attempts at, quote unquote ethical consumption and worrying about my carbon footprint and becoming a vegetarian for the environment and things like this, that didn't change the amount of plastic produced in a year. It didn't change the amount of oil consumed in a year. It didn't change the number of flights happening. It didn't change immigration policy or, various things.
I mean, I suppose that's it. That is the frustration of an individual actor. The people involved with Anjumi, and I suppose when you joined, there was a lot going on in terms of, particularly around supporting refugees and asylum seekers.
Yeah.
And there is direct action taking place. And there's a group of people who are like, okay, let's do this thing. Now, this goes from anything from writing statements to demonstrating outside Parliament to stopping planes taking off on runways. And not everybody is involved in every part of this. But if you as an individual decided to stand outside Parliament with a sign, you're considered a nut job.
Right.
If 15 of you do it, you're considered 15 nut jobs. If a few hundred of you do it, that's a different story.
Absolutely.
And therefore you get to a place where you can create a headline, you can start a discourse, you can reach other people, you can change minds, you can be in the conversation about what's happening in the world in a way that most people don't get to be unless they decide to become a politician.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I, as I listen to you list off these, this idea of like growing a movement, I'm immediately reminded of the most immediate like actions and successes of the movement for Palestinian rights and Palestinian independence that have been going on in Iceland, that have been going on in other parts of the world. And just that sense of connecting with others to deal with, like, because you see something so egregious, and finding that I'm not alone, that I'm not a nut job, that I want to go and like kick a window in or something, is my feeling. I can neither confirm nor deny any actual kicking of any actual thing, but yeah, this sense of okay, I'm not a nut job,
or at least I'm a nut job with these people.
Yeah, or that, exactly that.
No, I mean I'm being facetious. I think you're totally right. It is this, because the ultimate realization is also that even though you can do more as a collective, as a community, you can scream from the top of your lungs, you can get hundreds of people out in the street, and you can still affect nothing. Mm-hmm. And that's a really tricky one, because sometimes this can go two ways as well. And I wonder if you've seen this in terms of the groups you've been involved in, but there's a real tendency to burn out in these environments. My introduction to kind of thinking about how politics affects me as a child was being taken by my parents to protest against the invasion of Iraq. Mm-hmm. And as I can't remember how old I was, maybe like 9-10 years old, standing in the streets with so many people. These are big protests in the UK. Yeah. And just thinking with my sign and, I'm watching even bigger ones on the TV in London and Glasgow and Manchester and Edinburgh and all these, big cities around the UK. Mm-hmm. Looking at all these people and going, well, there's no way Tony Blair can ignore this. We're his voting constituents. We're his public, and we are saying no, thank you. Mm-hmm. So that's that. Job's a good one, done and dusted. And when it still went ahead, that was my first experience of, okay, you can get together with a large group of people. You can find community. You can agree on one thing together, and you can shout about it very loudly and still change nothing. Mm-hmm. So it feels. And that, for me, what that meant was just kind of this real like, oh, okay, well then it doesn't matter what I say or do.
Right.
And that took a long while to get over that, and to get to come back to a belief in being able to affect change, or the importance of still coming together. And for me, that importance is not just about affecting the change, but finding how many people feel the same way as you. Mm-hmm. And I think that, to me, is the grounding of community. And I like the way that you put it earlier about not necessarily being on the same page, but reading from the same book. Mm-hmm. Because it's not about finding a group of people who agree with you exactly. If you're not kind of questioning each other's views a little bit, then you should be a little bit worried, I think.
Absolutely.
That goes for a lot of things. Yeah. But finding a support network, finding energizing relationship with people. Mm-hmm. And if one thing doesn't work, finding another solution, finding another way to do the thing. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something I found in Andrimi, and I think other movements and organizations I've been involved in are certainly aware of this in terms of burnout, which you mentioned, for example, because I think it takes a lot out of us to engage, especially if I think there's many factors. We talked about being in our homes and doing our own individual little things and of trying to look out the window. And I think that, for example, is a feature of capitalism, that your consumption, your individual consumption is what matters, and the breaking down of community and atomization, individualization, that's going on because it makes you a much less effective political actor. It lets the kingmakers at the top carry on spending their money and extracting, and there's none of this petty vox populi that they have to worry about if all you hear is a slight background hum and not a roaring, crashing wave of outrage. Yeah, and so I think about this, for example, that there's the let's do it together and be out in the streets and be a couple 100,000 million people.
Million not possible in Iceland.
Not possible in Iceland, but I am thinking about I don't know if there are millions, maybe collectively, but for example, something just brought to mind the protests in Serbia. That are really a great example of hope. Let's say that. I feel very hopeful to see from what I've heard of the protests in Serbia
that are going on just now.
That are going on just now since November, I believe. But now we've gone rather far afield.
Let's come back to Iceland and to Andrumi, and to give people more of a sense of Andrumi. And I think important to kind of almost make a distinction between Andrumi the place and Andrumi the community around it. So Andrumi is a house.
Yes.
In Bergþórðargata in downtown Reykjavik. And now it's this space. It has a library. It has a free shop, which is a kind of swap thrift kind of thing. It has a kitchen. It hosts these meals. People from the community go out. They go dumpster diving. And they cook these free meals. It has a bike repair workshop. It has meeting spaces. Andrumi is for all. It's free. It's open. It has opening hours. It has events. Of course, to maintain the running of the house, there's donations encouraged when you can. Yep. In general, it's free to attend. Can you tell me from your perspective what feels radical about having a space like that for people today in 2025?
Right. I guess, you mentioned a few of these things that exist in the space, the free shop, the bike workshop, the people's kitchen, various things like this. I think what might feel radical in this day and age is both what seeks to be a conscious connection to marginalized groups, be they refugees, asylum seekers, queer folks, people that use drugs, for example. I'm thinking about all kinds of different projects and groups that have at some point made use of Andrumi. I think what runs through all of these things is this, sort of desire to build connection among people who, let's say, capitalism has decided are expendable or not worth consideration, which makes me shudder to utter the words. But and also just to try and create a space where things are available not for consumption but for need or pure joy or sense of community. I think about people that got together and just had fun fixing bikes. They didn't do it because they needed to fix a bike necessarily, but they just liked it. And so okay, bring your bike over. I'll show you how to do something. Hey, you want to develop some photos? We used to have a dark room. Come on down. I'll show you how to develop some photos if you've never done it before. I know of someone who fixed a sewing machine, and they had a couple of meetings and said, bring, if you've got a sewing project you want to work on, come make use of the sewing machine. I just fixed it. And if you have something you're not sure how to do, then let's figure it out together. I think in this moment we're living in, it feels radical to try and come together without a profit motive, without the motive of transaction, to do something. I remember seeing an article. It's a conversation I've seen popping up around me in the last year and a half. It's always been there, but I think it's coming to a head. But there was this article. The headline was, "I don't know my neighbor," and he talked a bit about I don't know who lives beside me. I don't know who lives above me, below me. What if I need to borrow a screwdriver? Or what if I just, want to do whatever? And I think, I don't remember if it was explicit, but I think there's this desire to know our neighbor. And so it can feel radical, even though in my mind it shouldn't, to like come together in a space and say like, hey, who are you? You're welcome here. Without ideally, and I say ideally because I think Andrumi has to think about that, you know, that we're not as barrier free as I think we dream we can be, or imagine we are. But nonetheless, there's this desire to be a barrier free place for people to just exist together.
Thinking about what you're saying about this desire to be barrier free, or kind of imagining that you're barrier free. You yourself, and when you're talking about your first experiences of going into Andrumi, you've talked about how you felt a bit inadequate or kind of on the back foot a little bit with where you were in your understanding, development, whatever. This idea that people were ahead of you, or that you looked at the library and of course you were excited by all the books that were there, but I'm sure it was also kind of a daunting experience, or that there was certain lingo, certain vocabulary that people were using. You know, all of these are things that communities have that are excluding factors.
Yeah.
And if you've never walked past Andrumi on the streets, beautiful building, gorgeous murals on it, and it has a lot of signs in the windows and flags and bits and pieces, all of which are great ways of telling people what you're about. But obviously some people are going to look at that and think, that's for me, I'm of that ilk, these people are for me. And some people are going to look at it and think the exact opposite. What do you think communities can do to be aware of these potential barriers to entry? And do you necessarily think that they're a bad thing?
Great questions. I think so. Okay. I have to sort of put a couple of different threads together. I don't want there to be a barrier for someone new to join the space I'm in. I'd want the space, whatever space I inhabit, and I'm speaking a bit vaguely here, you know, beyond Andrumi as it exists, but I want anyone to feel welcome in Andrumi, except there are some barriers. No cops.
Well, I mean, that's something, right? That's kind of why I'm asking the question, because there are these sort of like principles there, or, you know, that you are creating some of this, whether intentionally or not, is by design. You're saying, hey, we're for this kind of person. And that what you might be communicating might be more narrow than you might want it to be.
Yeah.
But there are people who wouldn't be welcome in Andrumi.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from within a community, I think you really need to sit down. It doesn't happen in one sitting, but you need to ask yourself, who isn't here?
Yeah.
You need to be aware of who is here and who isn't here. And I don't know if a concrete example helps, but I think a lot about women seeking asylum or refuge in Iceland. I don't see them so often in Andrumi. I see young men more often, and I don't have contact with these people that aren't there to get a sense of what's, you know, do you want to be here? And if so, why do you feel like, you know, or what's getting in the way of that? And actually, I've had 2 instances recently of people, they've been great conversations. A young man who got involved in Andrumi recently, who said, you know, I'd walked by several times and I liked the flags and things in the windows, but I wasn't sure, you know, if this would be for me or if I'd be welcome. And to me, that was like, it shouldn't have been a wake-up call, but it was. You know, I can't say why I felt empowered to walk in on my own, even though I was shy. And it was also a bit of a slap in the face to realize, like, oh, I've been within so long that I no longer know what it is to be new. You know, that I don't know who it was, but another person, for example, raised this point about lingo, and saying like, you know, sorry, what's a bottom liner? I love these questions.
But it takes courage to ask them.
Absolutely.
And again, like once you've kind of, even if you've gotten yourself in the door, if you suddenly get in there and you suddenly think, oh, I don't know what anyone is talking about.
Yeah.
This can't be for me.
Exactly. And you don't want to appear ignorant.
Yeah.
So I think that's another aspect of like, how does a community develop its awareness? And I think Andrumi is at this point where we've been around for a few years. Things have changed significantly in society for the people who take part in Andrimi and for the people and just society at large. And I think we're at a crossroads where there is a real question about why are we keeping this afloat?
Right.
It's a tough question. I've heard these things. So there was this young man who was telling me how do I get into Andrimi? Will I be welcome? And then another woman who came to our last General Assembly and said, I'm working on something, and it gave me the excuse to show up here.
Wow.
That I'm doing this project, and she needed a reason to walk through the door. And in a way, I get it. You don't want to experience rejection. You don't want to put yourself out there, take the brave step. The courageous, ask the question, and then get rejected or found wanting. And I've heard this criticism, and I think it's valid of people feeling I haven't read the right books, and I haven't gone over the syllabus, and I don't want there to be an Andrimi syllabus. And so it's interesting to hear these views. I need to hear them because I think they're a problem, frankly. So I guess there is this, I said, what is Andrimi and who is it for, and why do we keep the ship afloat? And I guess, speaking just personally, I keep the ship afloat because Andrimi has been so important to me, and I want someone else in my shoes way back in 2018, if they want, to have that same sense of coming home or feeling seen.
That's a big responsibility for a space and a community to have. You're kind of hinting at the fact that Andrimi has kind of changed a lot over the course of the years that it's been active. And it's kind of almost inherent with a place like Andrimi, partially because of how it sets itself up in kind of opposition from kind of typical or regular life. Yeah. That there is always a little bit of tension in terms of its existence. And almost that should kind of be the case because it is there in kind of cooperation with the city. But it also, regularly people and communities and groups from within the house are in opposition to the city, and there's all of this kind of, so you kind of, in a similar way to a union, in a way, you want there to be a bit of tension. You're there to point out the fact that certain things, you don't want them to be like that. So you're constantly raising awareness of yourselves in that way, but also constantly putting yourselves in a position where there's some kind of slight conflict with the powers that be. Yeah. But at the same time, while that has always been going on, and there's always been challenges around that, the community is facing challenges at the moment where the house is just not being used as much. And that causes, of course, financial issues. And I suppose for someone like you who came in as this newbie and this bright-eyed, fresh-faced young lad, but you're now kind of part of, if there is... And of course, all of these words are kind of rejected by Andrimi, but part of the establishment to a certain degree.
Let's be honest about it. Yeah.
You've been a member, a consistent and integrated member of that community for a long time. Let's put it that way. Your needs from that space will have changed over time. Yeah. So you will use that space differently. And these people who could be in your shoes, how do you find them? How do you reach them? What do you think there is still a need for this? Do you think they are out there? Do you think there's a requirement for a space like Andrimi still? Or has society at large changed too much for it to be a relevant requirement for people?
I think that something like Andrimi is really vital. Insofar as I hope it makes its small contribution to imagining an alternative, right? There is just a workshop here, and there is just a meeting space here that I can come and use. Once I've gone through the hoops, and there is a hoop to getting key access to the house in terms of doing a safer space workshop. And maybe that's another bit of lingo that your listeners wonder, well, what is a safer space and what is a safer space workshop? But as for the question of whether or not society has changed too much, I wonder, I feel an accelerating pressure in society broadly. I think it's quite manifest economically, just in terms of cost of living, the price you pay at the grocery store, your wages. We've known it's been a problem for a long, long, long time. And yet I think we find ourselves in increasingly troubling, demanding times where a space like Under Me relies on people having energy. And I think society is, it's not society that saps our energy, but the crushing weight of late stage capitalism saps our energy, keeps us atomized. Again, it comes back to this, so that showing up to try and be a part of something becomes harder and harder because you've got to work longer hours. You're not making any money by participating in Under Me. It can drain your energy, but you've also got you've got your laundry, and you've got your kids, and you've got your worries about your asylum status, and you've just got to put food on the table for yourself or for others. So I think that acceleration, that pressure that I feel has an impact. And I think it impacts what I think is needed from Under Me, which is that if we want new people, if we want vitality, there needs to be consistency. And that's where I think we're really struggling at the moment. Yeah, we need that consistency. It's not there. And I've heard this frustration from people.
Consistency in terms of opening times, or in terms of what you're doing or who you are, or what is this consistency?
I think opening time, I think just in a concrete sense, like that I know the house is being used, that I can go and that I can join in on something. And that, I heard a very valid criticism from someone who said, I tried to return a library book. It took me 3 weeks or something because it just wasn't open at a time that the times that I tried. And we're not so formalized an organization. So we don't have a social media manager posting about our opening hours. And our opening hours, they come and go with people's energy and where they are in their lives and their work. We recognize the importance of having them. For example, I see to the library, and I tried for a little bit to have library opening hours, but I've also got a PhD to finish, and I've got teaching. I gotta earn some money to pay my rent. And then also, the couple of times I had the library open, the couple of times I did opening hours, it was just me. And so there's a disconnect there, right? Because I'm trying to put some energy in to say, like, I want to make the space available, but I'm missing the people who then say, like, I'm frustrated that I can't get into Under Me. And then, of course, why should I donate if it's just an empty house, which I totally understand. So, I'm glad we're having this conversation because it's also forcing me to think about, like, how do I bridge this gap? How do I bring these things into alignment? How do I meet these people who say, like, I want to join in? How?
Right, because from a community perspective there, when we think about a community that is working, that is creating value and benefit, whether or not that benefit can be measured in monetary terms or production of something or whatever, what we want to sense as a community member is I put energy in and I receive energy back. Now, that's not necessarily a neat exchange. It doesn't have to happen in the same moment, but there has to be some kind of trust. Like if you show up and do the library hours and you do that 5 days a week and someone comes in on one day, that will feel like a wasteful use of your resources. Unless while you're there, there's also a community meal every night, and then you get fed and you get taken care of, and you can kind of trust that there's some kind of what I put in now, I will get back in some way. Not necessarily measurable as equal, but it will feel valuable to me. In the same way with the people who are doing a monetary donation, who then have the frustration of the times that they've shown up to return a library book, they haven't been able to, that feels unequal for them. I guess I'm interested to where that tipping point is in a community, in your experience. When does something feel valuable and when does it not? When can you kind of gain something for yourself by putting something in versus when does it just feel like you're throwing energy or money or time that you don't have to spare into a void?
Right. Oof. I think if I had the answer, we wouldn't be here. But
that's fair enough.
And but that's also to say, again, an individual isn't the one who's going to, untangle this knot. Where is the tipping point? What is coming to mind, I guess, is maybe I can't put words to the tipping point, but I can tell you when it feels right. I think I got started in Under Me. I got involved in a lot of different working groups related to, getting us the house and managing the finances and dealing with inclusion, trying to address, barriers. And, I liked these meetings. They were meetings. It was business time. But I liked them because there was this sense of camaraderie. And that was very nourishing. I didn't mind that we were talking about the time period that we have to give the city before, if we end our contract with them, for example, this line item. But I think the crucial thing for me was that the key, I'm doing something that feels worth putting my energy and time into, was when I was asked to teach English. A dear friend of mine reached out to me and said, a group of asylum seekers would like English lessons. A few of us got together and we're trying to create something, but you're a linguist and you've taught English before. Would you be interested in joining? And I said, sure, let's go for it. And that was so much fun because I was creating it with other people. And then the students themselves were really lovely and thankful and funny. And we had a good time. We had a good time at it. So maybe that's it. When's the tipping point? When you're not having fun anymore.
Yeah.
Because I remember, it wasn't that I had energy to give away. I remember running all over the city, and I was, at one end of the city, and I have to take the bus because I don't have a car. And I'm at one end of the city tutoring kids, and then I had to race to do these English lessons, but it was always worth it. I remember that. And I lived in Grovo, so I had an hour commute home at the end of all of this stuff. But I was just this is great. So it's not to say that, it's going to be fun and games all the time, but it shouldn't be a chore.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Listening to you answer that question, there were some themes that I want to pick out, because I think what you're saying, if I'm interpreting you right, is that essentially for this to feel meaningful and valuable for you, is that there needs to be connection. There needs to feel like there's space to grow or develop or go somewhere. You're talking about being involved in projects, that we're doing things, that we're having an impact that you could see.
Yes.
And that it has to create energy for you. And I think that's when you're saying when it stops being fun, but then you're also saying it doesn't have to be fun and games. But I think it's this really hard to pin down sense of that you are, like you were saying with these people you were teaching English to, that they were energized by you and then you were energized by them. So there's the exchange of energy that can feel, I liked how you put it, nourishing. It really is. It feels like an essential part of living that can sometimes feel very lacking, that we can only get from community.
Yeah.
I just wanted to reflect that back to you, I guess. That's how I was experiencing what you were saying, that there's kind of these key tenets. I mean, how unique do you think that is to Andromy, or is this something that's kind of broader to community in general?
No, I think it's broader to community in general, is my feeling. Of course, I'm also in Hapnar House with you. And, I think a lot of people enjoy being here because, to borrow from your dialect, there's craic.
There's good kræk.
There's good kræk.
I want to just make very clear that is spelled CRAIC and in no other way.
No other way.
And I'm going to put a dictionary definition of that in the show notes.
Right there. Yes, good. Yeah, absolutely. And there's banter, there's connection. And it's nourishing. I've heard people say, I'm newly arrived in Iceland, or I've been in Iceland for a while, but I'm an immigrant, and I found community here. Yeah. And it was nourishing. Yeah. And I made friends, and I got involved in something cool that I otherwise wouldn't have. Or even just got excited on someone's behalf that they were cooking up something really cool.
Or literally cooking.
Which
happens here a lot too.
That's very true. And therein, actually, I think, there was a moment where the communal lunches, there had to be a pause. And there was a moment of transition where people, weren't there. There wasn't a communal lunch, and then I think there was this like, oh no, we recognized there was a glue here.
Yeah.
Of coming together at 12:30 and getting this lunch.
It's this consistency that you're talking about.
And that I can trust that showing up, there's going to be some nice folks, some good food, and a space for me. Yeah, reliably so. And because it's reliable, then it's worth whatever it takes to get there, to haul myself out of bed, get out of my bathrobe, drink my coffee and my whiskey, and then get on the bus and go.
Wow, your mornings are wild, Alec.
Absolutely. I really relate to the song, whatever it's called by Kesha, where she brushes her teeth with a bottle of Jack. I was like, she gets me.
I could not have even anticipated in the slightest that this podcast episode would include a mention of Kesha, but I'm not mad about it. No. I'm here for it.
Also, a little bit of insight into my mornings. So,
back on track.
And so Hopner House recognized that we all want this connection, this reliability, this thing to show up for. The person who is seeing to it can't see to it right now. We don't want to lose this. We're going to have to do something together.
Yes.
And it means we're going to have to slice off a piece of our, or use whatever metaphor you want, spend some spoons, or take a chunk out of our day and figure this out.
Right. And this has resulted in just members of the community putting themselves forward, volunteering. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is some reimbursement and, of course, ingredients and everything is covered because we pay for the meals here. Yep. But it is people taking time out of their day.
Yes.
People who are not chefs, people who are, not in any kind of professional capacity, are taking time out of their day where they might be a video game designer or a furniture builder or whatever other people do in Hopner House to cook a meal for their fellow members.
Yeah, absolutely.
And no one's being forced to do it.
No.
And a lot of people are like, that's not for me. I don't want to do that. I'm not good at that. Or I couldn't cope with cooking a meal for 50 people. But a lot of people are up for it. And they're up for it because they get something back from that experience that isn't just monetary or, there's not people who are trying to find a chef job somewhere.
No, exactly. And I think we're getting at a kind of tipping point.
Yeah.
This change happened in the house. There was momentum. People picked up the ball. At some point in Andrumi, whether things became too diffuse or too cliquey or too closed, like you pointed out, there's a barrier to cooking a meal for 50 people. You might show up and realize like, oh, I've got to skin a lot of potatoes. Right? This is, and I've bitten off more than I can chew. And maybe that's something that's going on in Andrumi. I can't realize the things I want to realize because I can't bite off this much on my own. And there isn't that reliability at this time. And, I didn't live here for 3 years, so I didn't see how things have changed until I moved back. And so, how do you get the engine to turn over? What's the issue? Is it people power? Is it time? Is it, we've talked about this cycle of energy, what is nourishing. I think momentum, again, plays a big part. And so we lost momentum somewhere. And I've seen some really nice examples. There was a really nice art gallery set up in Andrumi over a weekend. And I really felt this spark, this feeling of like, come, show up, be here. There's art on the walls. There's people to chat to. There's one bottle of wine we're splitting 97 ways. Everyone gets a thimble. And everyone was happy with the thimble because how nice. Someone dug up a bottle of wine. So you don't need much. And again, it gets back to, if you could put your finger on what it is, what set of variables you need to tweak, then you could kick the engine over again. But of course, it's not that simple.
It's not that simple. It's a challenge, and I think it's a challenge that's faced by a lot of communities. And something that I want to touch on here is this idea of success. Let's imagine, let's not hope for it, but let's imagine that Andrumi were to have to close the house. How then would you measure the success of what Andrumi was or is? And does the fact that the house doesn't exist anymore, would that constitute a failure? Or is it simply just at this point in time surplus to requirement?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. I think the first question about success dovetails very nicely off of the last bit of our conversation, because I think when you put yourself into something, I think in the context of under me and things that are going on there, it's hard to measure success. And so then you think to yourself, is what I'm doing worth it? You know, I knew the English teaching was a success because people were enthusiastic to show up. They wanted more. They were like, can you teach 7 days a week? And I was like, literally. And I was like, I would love to, because I love your questions. I love thinking about language and thinking about, you know, how your mother tongue is influencing how you're producing this sentence. And, you know, it was fun. We were creating something together, and there was enthusiasm. And so I could feel success. I couldn't measure it. There wasn't, you know, I wasn't graduating people and handing out certificates and saying, great, you've achieved A1, you've achieved B1 English. But my time and energy there was a success because the people that I was doing it with were happy. They felt success. Everyone was in the success mindset. So there was something tangible there. So can you know, if under me closes the house, it won't cease to exist, because under me isn't just the house.
Yeah, if Under Me were to close the house, and it's not just the house, obviously, does that in any way invalidate the successes of before?
Not at all. Not at all. Not in the sense that, I think, not in the relationships that people have that they made there or they strengthened there. Not in the sense of all of the political action that came out of meeting in Under Me to be together, to paint a banner, to make a sign, to have a meeting, to have a cup of coffee after a protest and be in community and feel safe and calm yourself together. All of these things still exist. I'm getting a bit emotional. And you know, maybe it's something for us to sit back and, you know, I know that we've kicked around the idea of doing a kind of history, some kind of documentation. Maybe that's where we find our sense of success. We can't see the forest for the trees.
Right.
We're just in this never-ending succession of present moments in a society that feels less and less responsive to us. You know, you mentioned this with, surely Tony Blair can't ignore this many people. Well, surely the government of Iceland can't ignore this many people. And yet, you know, I've never felt further away from my so-called elected representatives. I've never felt more alienated from the establishment that is supposed to govern society that I signed the social contract for. So yeah, maybe Under Me has to sit back and take a moment and say, like, what have we done here? Also to help us get a sense of where can we go?
Yeah.
You know, this thing that happened and this thing that happened and this thing that happened, they were beautiful and we're proud of them. Should we do that again? Because I think we've forgotten. And this is abroad in all communities, right? Knowledge transfer, remembering, taking the time to remember. And again, it leads me back a bit to a criticism of late stage capitalism that, like, you know, we don't pass on memory and skill in the same way that we used to. Well before my time or before my parents' time, you know, you think about skills of cooking and sewing and
maintenance, repair.
Being together. You know, I think one of the most beautiful examples of this is like walking songs from Scotland.
You're now speaking my language,
right? Absolutely. You know, and I see these videos and I think to myself, like, I would love that. Think about this. We could just like bang on some wool for a while, sing a song together, be together, create something together. And at the end, we've also made something. Like, it's just, you know, so we need to look at our history to get a sense of we need to look at our past to get a sense of our future.
Wow. Okay. We can't possibly end it there. No, I think you make a very valid point, and you touch on something that I think's interesting that I haven't necessarily considered before, in the sense of course, some of these things, if you think about walking songs from Scotland, now that's, to again, clarification on spelling, that's Waulking. Walking is a way of making tweed fabric, and it was also done in Iceland in a different way back. But in order to once you've woven the fabric, in order to shrink it and make it more waterproof and durable and wearable, you would need to beat the fabric. And this was done in Scotland primarily with groups of women, and they would sing songs to help them keep the rhythm, but also to share gossip and stories and, talk about their husbands.
Mm-hmm.
That practice became obsolete because that method of making cloth was rendered obsolete through the advancement of technology and innovation. However, what people failed possibly to recognize at the time was its secondary function as community strengthening, community building.
Mm-hmm.
If a new, wife came to the township because she'd married in from a different community, that's where she would meet everybody and become part of that community. I'm not saying that walking songs are going to solve everything, but I think what you're saying is that when we lose these skills that we pass on to one another, we also lose the connection that we have to one another within a society. And I suppose, without being grandiose about it, in some ways, places like Andromeda become the alternative to churches or other spaces where people would regularly meet other members of their community.
Yeah.
And then things like the bike repair workshop or sewing or whatever, that becomes the replacement to the ways that you would do that within your extended family or within your shared block of apartments.
Yeah.
I think that is not an insignificant thing to be able to experience in this day and age.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about your example of a new wife moving to a township. There's not going to be a connection to the community if they're only walking the fabric once every 27 days, maybe.
Yeah.
That there was a consistency there.
Mm-hmm.
And that consistency, I guess, arose out of necessity. We want to make this material, and we also want to gossip. I mean, there's you can see there's multiple, like, I don't want to use such an engineering example. I'm going to try and find something a bit more. I was thinking about feedback loops, but I want a more organic example. There's multiple sources of nourishment that are happening there and that happen in Andromeda, but it's a very, it's a more delicate thing than I think we think. Now I'm thinking about the natural world and pushing our biosphere to its utmost limit. And, it's a bit too grand a comparison, but we see now we can't just right the ship one way. It's not just planting more trees, and it's not just fixing the North Atlantic turnover or oh no, this has affected the Gulf Stream and this is affecting ice runoff from Greenland, and Siberia is melting and releasing methane in crazy amounts, chaos in the system, and at a tiny, tiny, tiny micro scale, bringing us back. And to get back to my metaphor of turning the engine over, Andromeda is puttering along. It's still there. It's something I'm very proud of, but we're not thriving, I feel. And I want to thrive because I want to be there for people that may not even know they're looking for something like Andromeda yet, like I was back when I started. And I stumbled upon it, and it's something I'll be grateful for the rest of my life.
Well, I hope for many different reasons that Andromeda does begin to thrive again. Mm-hmm. Thanks for taking the time to go through everything from Kesha to Noam Chomsky and back again.
And back again.
I'll put links and information to Andromeda in the show notes. But for now, thank you for a very meaningful and thoughtful conversation, Alec.
Thank you so much, Josie.